Hello. So this week I was given E. Cummings, and to be quite honest, when I was first reading and looking into him, or at least getting through his poems, I wasn't entirely sure if I liked it, or if I really understood where he was kind of coming from. But the more and more that I researched him, the more that I did find a lot of things that I appreciated about his work, and just kind of about his viewpoint on life in general. So, looking at his life and influences, he was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was quite well educated, received his bachelor's and his master's from Harvard for it, but he also did start his creative life very early on. And so, from the ages of 8 to 22, he wrote a poem a day, which just seems like a crazy amount of dedication, especially for a child to be looking into. But that worked out for him fairly well, I guess, because by the end of his life, he was the second most read poet in the United States, just short of Robert Frost. So he started his kind of actual career getting into World War One. So even though he was a pacifist, he decided to join the war effort as an ambulance driver for the French. And that, I guess, was quite boring. He was over there with a friend, William Slater Brown, and to pass the time, the two of them would start putting veiled and provocative messages encoded into their letters home. And all that was to baffle and confuse the French censors who were reading all that mail and making sure that nothing funny was going on. Evidently, the French did think something funny was going on because they imprisoned both of them into a labor camp because they suspected that they might be spies or whatnot into there. So, I mean, he was lasted 3 months. His father did a huge protest, busted him out, but he took his accounts there, his experiences, and he wrote a fictionalized account called The Enormous Room. And that is actually in our anthology as well. It's on page 207, and I highly encourage that you guys read that. It's quite short. It's only like a page and a half or so. But what I like about it is that when you're looking at the way that Cummings played with language and just his kind of viewpoint, it's helpful to see that in prose, because when you're looking at his work in verse, you have the constraints of poetry, which is meant to be, language elevated and playing with stuff, and that makes it a little more difficult to kind of see the motivations that were him as the man versus what his output as a poet was. So it's well worth the read, and it kind of gets you into his mindset, I guess, as the case would be. So digging into his poetry style, he became interested in modernist poetry and innovation in general after reading some of Ezra Pound's work. He was also influenced by Gertrude Stein for that as well. And he's well known for playing with the visual look of a poem. So he would separate out words. He would put just a single one, there on the line or whatnot. But the visual effect of the poem was just as important to him as the actual contents or the line work, the words themselves. But he played with the language there as well. He would mash together words and to make new words. He would put his own little definition on things as well. But he was very much a rugged individualist. He felt like art was always about that individual expression for those things. And he had a huge issue with he called it was one of his mashed up words, but most people. And this idea of this overarching thought of society that confines you into boxes. In fact, our anthology says that his poetry continued to attack on deep, personalized, commercial, exploitive mass culture and celebrated loners, lovers, and nonconformists. And I think that gets into a lot of, maybe not necessarily so much as what his content was, but in the way that he wrote poetry for it. So he was widely accessible. In fact, the critic Randall Jarrell, poet too, said that no one else has made avant-garde experimental poems so attractive to the reader. And he wrote a whole bunch on sex and war, and also a lot on more common or passé topics in poetry, like flowers and childhood and whatnot, and love. But that made him very accessible. He used a lot of common speech as well, getting into his stuff. And so, that worked out well for him and for what his style was. One of the other things I'd like to mention here, just to think about in your mindsets as you're going through his poetry, is imagine what it would be like to write one of his poems now in a word processor when you've got autocorrect and spell check and whatnot immediately underlining things and telling you that you're wrong and that this is incorrect for it, which is super useful and they're meant to be helpful. But in looking at it in the way that Cummings would have, is that not also restricting and telling you, well, this is what your output is going to look like? This is what your words on your page should be, and it's giving you kind of this form to fill. So I just think that's an interesting juxtaposition between or example of what he was kind of talking about there with it, and sort of what in the 1920s he would have been much more free to do. That he didn't have those kind of things wearing on him, right? And so we saw poetry as a process and not a product, and I think that shows a bit more as we get into that a lot of his poems just seem like they started in the middle of stuff and whatnot. There's a lot of, I don't want to say destabilized, but he played with things enough that you couldn't necessarily guarantee that it was going to be a self-contained thing. So it was much more about that expression of that individualism for it. And then one final thing as we get into it, and this is sort of an aside as well, but I really enjoyed it, in part because I do quite a bit of theater. But he did write a play, and it was so-so for what the critics thought about it. But at the beginning of that play, he put a little bit of an introduction that said, relax and give the play a chance to strut its stuff. Like many strange and familiar things, life included, this play isn't about, it simply is. Don't try to enjoy it, let it try to enjoy you. Don't try to understand it, let it try to understand you. And I think that that's so neat to think about the concept of an artistic creation, a poem, a play, anything like that, as a living entity that is exploring its own individuality, but also exploring the world at the same time, at the point of its creation, which is fascinating, and making that into this like kind of living, breathing creature. It was just a real neat way, and I think it exemplifies some of his thought and what went into his poetry. So let's get into one. So I chose In Just. And I chose this one specifically because I felt like it brought up several of the things that he was well known for, and I do just kind of like it as well. So In Just, spring, when the world is mud, luscious the little lame balloon man whistles far and wee, and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee, and Betty and Disbel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. So what's neat looking at this, I was just looking at the title and getting into there, is that the I is undercase or lowercase, but the J on the just is uppercase, and so is In Just with this dash. So to me, that shows this sort of interruption on things. And I can't tell, or couldn't tell initially looking at that, is that in just as in just this moment, and it's kind of this pause of that, or is this the pause of injustice? And so that this is in just. And when it's broken up like that, you get both of those concepts kind of latched onto each other, which I thought was neat. The next word here is spring, super important to the poem. We know because it's been repeated 3 times as it goes in. But this is all about that renewal, time of youth, all those connotations that we throw to spring itself. And then that's followed up, we get the pause, which gives spring more weight, but then when the world is mud, which is true. It is mud season in the spring, it's raining, snow's melting and whatnot, but it also has this connotation of things being a little cloudy or confusing for it. We get into the lame balloon man whistles far and wee. This sort of seems like odd imagery. We'll get into that as we delve deeper through into the poem. But the way that whistles, space, far, space, and wee gives this sort of a ethereal feel to it. And then it's small and far away with the balloon man himself is, a balloon is just an airy construction as it goes in. But then the next stanza says, and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring. And so here, that form is much more compact, which allows it to be a single thing. But even getting into the wordplay here, where he smashes together Eddie and Bill, shows that they are one concept that is enjoying this moment together, that they are strongly connected in that way, which I think is neat to have the form fit the meaning of that. And it's also this just very great moment of childhood innocence. Spring is again stuck down there to remind us that we're connecting to that idea. And then we get back into the old balloon man, but here he's described as queer or strange, but he's whistling far and wee. And then it jumps immediately back in using the same sort of construction stuff with Betty and Disbel, who's playing hopscotch and jump rope and whatnot. And then gets back in, we see spring again. And then this is this final bit with the balloon man. And I think that it's this iteration of it that kind of gives us a clue as to what might be going on here. Because it's been a little strange. We get the image of the balloon man, this moment of childhood innocence, repeated back and forth between these two concepts. But it's not really clear what the balloon man is. So looking in here, we now get this goat-footed comment there. And to be honest, I had to look this up because I was a little confused. But goat-footed does represent Pan. I read a lot of cosmic horror and fantasy in my off time, which doesn't help at all as a reference for any of the work that we do here in class. So I normally try to shoo that out and not bring that in as much because it's just not as helpful. And I should have in this one because it is actually about a mythological creature. It should have been immediately, into something in my brain. So anyway, satyrs or Pan, Greek mythological creature, well known for being lusty and sexualized and whatnot. And so that really shows us that the balloon man might be representing something a bit more adult in this otherwise very childhood innocence poem. And because spring is happening so much here, and it's about this renewal and kind of youth, I'm going to take that as the default setting for this, and the balloon man is intruding upon that. So what we have here is a contrast of looking at these young, youthful childhood images, and then this idea of adulthood, this rite of passage of that sort of sexualized being of life and whatnot. But I really like in the form of it, it says here goat-footed, mythological creature, but then now on balloon man, it capitalizes the M on the man again, which is now connecting that back into that humanity for it. Meaning that it's further on in these kids' lives. And I think that that's really where we get here, is that it is about, children enjoying this moment in spring, just this moment of childhood innocence before life becomes complicated in these adult worries and whatnot. And when you look now back into the poem of some of the things that he describes for it, sure, when we don't really know what's going on, luscious is in there, and there's a lot of luscious things about being an adult. But, little and lame, queer, that it's strange, he's old, but that he's whistling far off in there, and that he seems small and out of the way, which is exactly how children would be looking at those kind of concepts of it. So to me, my interpretation, again, your mileage may vary, but for me, what this really shows is that it is about that moment of childhood innocence, but knowing that at some point in time, that these other things, that concept of the balloon man is going to come into it. So taking it full circle to the unjust is that it does, in my mind, work into both of those concepts, because it is just taking this slice of this moment, that unjust of childhood, but it is also the injustice of the fact that we eventually have to leave that moment and give the balloon man his due. As he's out there. So anyway, this was enjoyable. I hope it was something good for you guys as well. Thank you again so much for your time and attention as we get into there. I'll drop my prompt suggestions in with my post, and you guys have a great one.